kingfisher goes about its daily routine of catching a fish. Around the world, this image, or one very like it, can be found along the wooded banks of almost any quiet river or stream. Kingfishers are a worldwide group. The family got its ordinary English name by the pure chance that there is only a single species in Europe, which happens to be a member of the group that lives beside streams and catches fish for a living. It was only later discovered that neither of these characteristics is necessarily true of other members of the family. The family ranges in size from a tiny African species weighing barely 10 grams to the laughing kookaburra of Australia, at 400 grams, the heaviest kingfisher in the world. The fact is that the kingfishers tend to fall into two broad groups, three if you include American species, with rather different lifestyles. The so-called land kingfishers, of which there are many species in Australia, live for the most part away from water and feed mainly on reptiles, such as skinks and similar prey. The water kingfishers, on the other hand, live along streams and rivers and live mainly on fish. But in both groups, whether the target is a lizard on the sand or a small fish in the water, the basic tactics of the kingfisher's attack on its prey remain basically the same. A sudden dive or pounce from a perch in a tree 1 or several meters above the surface. This is the azure kingfisher, which is common across much of northern and eastern Australia, especially in coastal lowlands. A good deal of speculation has gone into attempts to explain why water kingfishers bob their heads like this, so far without result. The most plausible suggestion offered so far is that it might have something to do with judging the precise depth of the target fish under the water. The plunge is just as likely to be from a slant as straight down. Prey usually consists of fish small enough to be swallowed head first, with a quick flick of the bill on regaining a perch. However, if the fish is intended as food for young in the nest, then it is usually handled tail first, to make it easier for the chicks to swallow. Kingfishers nest in long, narrow burrows tunneled into the riverbank, sometimes used for several years in succession. As in all kingfishers, both parents cooperate in feeding the young, and a brood of 3 or 4 young kingfishers takes a lot of feeding. Of course, not all dives are for fish. A plunge is also a fine way to freshen up with a quick wash, shake and preen. Kingfisher chicks usually look a great deal like their parents, though a good deal duller and more dishevelled. They also have quite obviously shorter bills. Just like their parents, they frequently bob their heads in an apparently innate response. The youngsters are fed by their parents for some weeks, even after they have left the nest, because their first dives are clumsy and hesitant, and seldom successful. It takes them some time to learn to catch fish for themselves efficiently. Perhaps as an indication of Australia's status as one of the driest of all the continents, Australia has only 2 representatives of the so-called water kingfishers. We've just met one member, the azure kingfisher, and this is the other, the little kingfisher. But the little kingfisher in Australia is restricted to the northern tropics in the top end and on Cape York Peninsula. It also occurs in New Guinea. Perhaps the most widely known of all Australia's smaller kingfishers is the sacred kingfisher, largely because it is the only one that occurs in the eucalypt woodlands of southern Australia, although it also occurs almost throughout the continent, including Tasmania. In the south, it is strongly migratory, returning to southern woodlands in spring. Then it makes the woods resound with its evocative calls as it attends to the first 2 chores in the breeding cycle, establishing a territory and attracting a mate. Mating follows a ritual gift of some item of food presented by the male to his mate, though this is not entirely ceremonial. Female birds need abundant protein to form their clutch of eggs quickly, and courtship feeding is common among birds in general and kingfishers in particular. The sacred kingfisher often chooses a tree termite mound in which to nest. The parent birds excavate the cavity themselves, first penetrating the hard outer crust simply by flying at it beak first until it yields, then by patient excavation of the somewhat softer material within. The closely related and very similar forest kingfisher tends to replace the sacred kingfisher in the tropical coastal forests and woodlands of northern Australia. Its special plumage features are bright blue upper parts and a white patch in the wing, normally visible only when the bird flies. It resembles the sacred kingfisher in many aspects of behavior as well as appearance. For example, it too favors the earthen mounds built by tree termites, and pairs excavate their nesting cavities in exactly the same way. The tropical rainforests of the world shelter a wide variety of kingfishers of striking appearance and specialized habits, but few of these extend into Australian rainforests. One exception is the yellow-billed kingfisher, which is essentially a New Guinea species with the barest toehold on Australian soil. Here, it occurs only in the isolated rainforests at the tip of Cape York Peninsula. Because of its remote range, little is known of the life history of this species, but it resembles many other Australian kingfishers in size, proportions, and general behaviour, as well as in its tendency to select the homes of tree termite colonies in which to nest. But by far the most glamorous of all Australian kingfishers is surely this one, the buff-breasted paradise kingfisher or white-tailed kingfisher. Like the sacred kingfisher, it is a migrant, but its winter home lies in New Guinea. In October, it arrives back on its breeding grounds in the dense lowland rainforests of far northeastern Queensland, announcing its arrival with its penetrating, persistent call. Like others of its group, it feeds on large insects, small reptiles, and similar animals, captured on the ground by pouncing. The significant difference being that it confines its hunting to dense rainforest. The sexes are similar, and both possess the striking long white tail streamers, persistently waved up and down in a very distinctive manner. At the nest, both entrance and cavity are a tight squeeze for the parent birds, and the confinement of incubation normally means that the tail streamers are crushed against the inner walls of the chamber. So it's easy to tell birds that are nesting, because their tails are invariably curved and twisted, like this bird's. Like many birds that nest low in the forest, the parents make their visits to the nest as brief as possible, to minimize the risk of betraying its location to any hungry, predatory eyes that might be watching. Even so, this kingfisher's dexterity is impressive. This particular home delivery, for example, was completed twig to twig in 1.2 seconds flat. Made obvious by their black bills, juveniles are ready to leave for their winter home in New Guinea within a few weeks of leaving the nest. The kingfishers are a remarkably versatile group, widespread in deserts and rainforests alike. Of all its members, the red-rumped kingfisher is the one best adapted to life in the arid interior of the continent. Here, long years of drought may alternate with an unpredictable season or two of substantial rainfall, when the desert becomes a garden of wild flowers, and all bird inhabitants nest, in some cases having spent several years without even attempting to breed if conditions are too severe. The azure kingfisher we saw earlier had its nest in the bank of a stream. In fact, this general type of site, a cavity in a bank or tree, turns out to be a characteristic shared by almost all kingfishers. The red-rumped kingfisher is no exception. It also nests in banks, the most significant difference being that the river in this case is dry. Of all the kingfishers, this is the one best adapted to desert conditions. Their diet is varied. Anything of a reasonable size to handle, from locusts to skinks, is fair game for these kingfishers. When it comes to nesting, the red-rumped kingfisher is quite versatile. After all, there's a lot of land in deserts in which there are no riverbanks, dry or otherwise. This pair have found an acceptable substitute in the earth of the root system of an uprooted tree. Yet even here, the nest is essentially a hole in a bank. Unlike many other birds when nesting, these kingfishers do not remove the chicks' droppings, and occupied nests are often obvious from the whitewash of the chicks' droppings at the entrance. Three to 5 young constitute an average brood, and they fledge after about 3 weeks in the nest. The female often blocks the entrance with earth a few days before the young fledge, which prevents the more advanced chicks from leaving before their slower siblings are ready. She can then ensure that her brood leaves more or less together when she feels it is time to remove the plug a few days later. The red-rumped kingfisher is the desert representative of the clan in Australia. But the home of one of its closest relatives is entirely different: the mangrove swamps of northern and eastern Australia. Elsewhere in its extensive distribution, which extends from Arabia to the islands of the southwest Pacific, the collared kingfisher is often common in coconut plantations and similar coastal environments. But in Australia, it's mostly found in mangroves. Crabs constitute the favoured diet of collared kingfishers, though mudskippers and similar prey are also taken. These are captured in typical kingfisher style, in a pounce from a low perch, though the very nature of mangrove swamps and flats dictates that the perch is sometimes very low indeed. In most birds, the female's clutch of eggs adds up to a substantial part of her own total body weight. The collared kingfisher, for instance, lays 2 or 3 eggs, each weighing around 12% of her own weight. So, gathering enough protein to form 3 eggs, laid within a week, represents a severe drain on her metabolism. Any gift of food, for which she need not work to find for herself, is therefore a valuable offering. Though, by the look of things in this case, she might well be grumbling that he could have peeled it first. The 10 species of kingfishers in Australia represent a group of birds that are broadly similar in behavior, lifestyle, and even appearance, yet have successfully found a niche in virtually all of the varied natural environments across the continent.